welcome to this week's edition of The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. The autumn in Israel is the time for a series of biblical feasts. But for us Gentile Christians, these are perhaps little understood, so maybe largely ignored. But are they only for Jewish people? Or do they hold any relevance for us? My guest today will be able to answer this question. He is Evan Thomas, pastor of a congregation called Beit Asaph, situated just north of Tel Aviv in Israel. I spoke to Evan in early September and started by asking him to describe the mood in Israel where they were facing another wave of COVID.
This is the fourth wave, the Delta variant, so to speak, and has presented an enormous challenge to society here. Obviously to the health authorities, to the general population, and of course politically. Thank God we do have a stable government. We were able to get through elections, and I think that's very important because part of the previous problem was the instability in the political sphere, which created at the very least a lot of confusion and a lot more fear in the general population than was necessary. So you do have a sense of greater social stability, despite the fact that the health issue is dire. Of course, you're very familiar with the current statistics. I believe Israel has the highest infection rate in the world at the moment.
That must be very disappointing for you because you came out of lockdown earlier in the summer and now your numbers have gone straight up again. So what's the mood in the country?
I think generally speaking, I pick up a greater and greater move towards we're going to have to live with this one way or the other. I think there is a strong reliance on the broad span of vaccination, despite nevertheless a strong minority who are resistant to the vaccination process. But schools have gone back this week in kindergartens, and that's going to place a big test on the whole system. Children have been vaccinated. We have a phenomenal testing protocol in place and speed testing, and children who haven't been vaccinated must be tested on a very regular basis so that their current picture of immunity. So there's this resignation, I think would be the good word to use here, that we're going to have to learn to live with that the vaccination isn't a silver bullet, but it is a big help.
You mentioned that there's been a resistance amongst many people to the vaccination. Why is that?
There's a couple of things. Let me start with the body of Christ. I would say that the strong anti-vax lobby coming out of the West, particularly the Western Church, has created an atmosphere of disquiet and confusion and fear that behind the vaccination is a political push. I mean, you will hear really crazy terms being used like this is the new Holocaust because government is pushing back this vaccination so strong. The government is acting like Nazis. Yeah, here in Israel. Can you imagine how offensive that is to many of us, drawing parallels like that? But this is some of the speech that has been heard. Now, there is another level. I think there are some communities, for example, generally speaking, the Russian-speaking community is very nervous about following government regulations, particularly about health issues, because they were formerly really subject to abuse, government abuse in the past in the former Soviet Union, and those things remain in people's mindsets. Very, very cautious about listening to government, particularly when it starts to use a heavier hand.
So you've got friends, people you know who are refusing to have the vaccination. You've had it, I know. So it must cause quite a lot of tension within society.
It does cause a lot of tension, although Mala and I try and speak freely about these issues with our friends and colleagues and so on. Every now and again, you'll bump into a volatile reaction, So we have to be a bit careful. Where the rubber really meets the road is, for example, we are planning to have a full service, which we will have at the Israel College of the Bible. Beit Asaph no longer has a full worship facility of its own. We abandoned that. We could no longer afford to keep it up without being able to use it. So we have had one full service at the beginning of July. We're going to have another one on the 11th of September, interesting date. But because of government regulations and of the venue, people must have proof of immunity to be able to enter. Now, for most people, it'll be just a question, yep, no problem. We're not vaccinated. Somebody will say, okay, so we'll go and have our tests done so that we can take part. There will be a small minority who may say, how dare you even ask for this? And we're just going to have to be very firm. We'd rather we didn't, because we obviously don't want to discriminate, but we actually by law don't have a choice. And the venue itself would not allow us to hold an event without proof of immunity on the part of the participants.
Very difficult, because Israelis love their freedom, don't they? So you can see the mindset and the tension. Now, you mentioned the high holidays, Evan. Perhaps we could just explore this a little bit, because, as you say, they're coming up very soon now. So can you just take us through the program and what happens? And
Sure.
Is it just for Jewish people, or can we all join in?
Yeah, we can all join in. For the eve of the Jewish New Year is on Monday evening of next week. And then that is a 2-day holiday to follow. Tuesday and Wednesday will be a statutory holiday. And it's a time really to celebrate family, lots of special foods for the time. Apples and honey are always very foremost on the table. A real Thanksgiving time, and a time where we consider new beginnings. Directly following those 2 days, we begin the 7 days of awe that lead up to the not holiday, it's the commemoration day of Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. So those days prior to it, from Rosh Hashanah, really are days where everyone really considers themselves, their lives, seeks to set things right that haven't been right. Very biblical kingdom kind of concept that I think both Jews and Christians can relate to.
This is a biblical feast, Evan, if I can just interrupt you.
That's
it is
correct.
A biblical feast,
That's
a
correct.
preordained feast.
It is preordained, and for generations to generation, wherever we are. And the Yom Kippur, of course, is a 24-hour national fast. So you would eat together as a family prior to the fast, and then again once the fast is over. But nothing moves. The only vehicles that would be seen on Israeli roads will be emergency vehicles. And typically we begin to hear the birds in our neighborhoods with the noise levels come right down. And Marla and I love it. Most of us within the believing community love this day of quiet reflection. We love to typically and traditionally read the book of Jonah at that time, read throughout synagogues throughout the world. And we love to do that and look at the wonderful lessons of the book of Jonah. And once the fast is over, then we begin to prepare for the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, as we say in Hebrew. And it's very much a feast commemorating the Exodus from Egypt, where people in the wilderness lived in booths and tabernacles that they created, leafy branches and so on. But the remembering well the redemption journey, the Exodus, has a lot of parallels for us that follow, of course, the teachings of the Messiah and the apostles, and our own personal journeys of redemption. Again, lots of special foods, celebrations during that time. And interestingly enough, although we expected the government to place the country under lockdown, because obviously these high holidays are times of gathering, and sometimes in very large numbers, particularly the religious communities, but they haven't. So they have restricted gatherings to some extent. In some ways, socially, I think it will create a lot of relief. Time will tell what impact it has on the continuing struggle with the virus.
Now, you mentioned Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, because that is mentioned in Zechariah, and that one day all the nations will go up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. So where does that all fit in? How does it all come together?
Right. Well, the Feast of Sukkot is wonderful as much as it is very inclusive. Passover, by comparison, is a feast of the Jews. Now, I know there are lots of Christian communities around the world love to celebrate the Passover, and there's a wonderful teaching element to that, and I encourage it. But biblically, it is a great feast of the Jewish people. Sukkot, although a Jewish feast, is inclusive of the nations. And part of the messages of that inclusiveness is that it is prophesied of those days, as you rightly say in Zechariah, where the peoples of the nations will come up to Jerusalem and celebrate with the people of Israel the Feast of Tabernacles. In fact, it will be a commandment to do so. And we see certain incidents of that today where there are whole movements about celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles amongst Christian communities internationally as well. And maybe that's a bit of a prophetic picture of what is to come in the future.
You've been listening to Evan Thomas, pastor of a congregation in Israel, and we'll hear more from him on next week's programme. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab or Palestinian Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please visit our website, olivetreefund.org. Meanwhile, join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.